The morning air held the weight of November rain as hundreds gathered on Carpenter Street, their umbrellas forming a black canopy that stretched from the cathedral's brass doors to the corner where the trolley tracks curved east. The limestone facade rose 3 stories into the grey sky, each stone cut precise and clean, each window fitted with stained glass that would catch the sun on clearer days. Archbishop Dougherty stood at the threshold in his ceremonial vestments, his voice carrying across the crowd as he blessed the building with holy water. In the 3rd row, beneath a black umbrella held by his driver, Don Salvatore Montagna watched with eyes that had not slept in 3 nights. His hands were folded in prayer, his expression serene as carved marble. The crowd saw a benefactor, a man of means who had given his fortune to God. They did not see the tremor in his fingers or the way his jaw clenched when the archbishop spoke of redemption. They could not hear the names that whispered through his mind like a litany of the damned, names of men who had paid for every brick, every window, every carved angel that now looked down from the cathedral's heights. Names of men who would never kneel in these pews or feel sunlight through this glass. The cathedral had cost him everything, but the debt it was meant to settle remained unpaid. Before we continue the story of the cathedral built on blood, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell me where you're listening from, which city, which state. I'm curious to know who's brave enough to follow this story to the end. 3 years earlier, in the winter of 1945, Salvatore Montagna had stood in a different kind of building. The warehouse on Delaware Avenue smelled of river water and rust, and the concrete floor was stained dark in patches that no amount of bleach could lift. He had built his empire in places like this, spaces that existed in the gaps between law and order, where disputes were settled with handshakes or violence, rarely anything in between. That night he had come to settle a dispute. Vincent Caruso had been skimming from the numbers racket, pocketing 10% off the top for 6 months before someone noticed the discrepancy. It was not about the money. Salvatore made more in a week than Vincent could steal in a year. It was about the principle. It was about what happened when men forgot that every dollar, every favor, every breath they took existed at someone else's discretion. Vincent knelt on the concrete, his hands bound behind him with electrical cord. 2 of Salvatore's men stood on either side, their faces expressionless. The warehouse lights threw long shadows across the floor. "You understand why we're here," Salvatore said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. He had learned long ago that violence needed no theater. The outcome was the same whether you shouted or whispered. Vincent's mouth moved, but no sound came out. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face gray as old newspaper. He had a wife, 3 children, a house in Kensington that he was 2 months behind on. All of this information sat in Salvatore's mind like items on a ledger, facts to be noted and filed away. "I gave you opportunities," Salvatore continued. "I brought you into this business when you had nothing. I made sure your family ate, and you repaid me by stealing." "Sal, please," Vincent's voice cracked. "I can pay it back, every cent. I swear to God." "Don't," Salvatore said, raising one hand. "Don't swear to God in a place like this." He nodded to the man on Vincent's left. The gunshot was louder than expected, echoing off the warehouse walls and rolling out across the dark water of the Delaware. Vincent slumped forward, and the men dragged him toward the river access at the back of the building. In 10 minutes, there would be no body. In a week, there would be no investigation. Vincent Caruso would simply disappear, another casualty of a city that ate its own. Salvatore stood alone in the warehouse after his men left, listening to the sound of water against pilings. The rain had started, tapping against the roof like fingers on a confessional screen. He was 51 years old. He had been in this business since 1919, when he was 19, and Prohibition turned every basement and back room into opportunity. 26 years of survival, of violence, of watching men rise and fall according to laws that existed nowhere but in the unwritten codes of the street. He had killed his first man at 22, a hijacker who had tried to steal a truckload of Canadian whiskey on the Benjamin Franklin Bridge. He could still remember the weight of the pistol, the way the man's expression changed in the instant before the trigger pulled. Since then, he had lost count. Some he killed himself, Most he ordered killed, which amounted to the same thing in the eyes of God, if there was a God, if God paid attention to places like this. Salvatore walked out of the warehouse into the rain. His car waited at the curb, black and anonymous, its engine running. He climbed into the back seat and his driver pulled away without a word. Heading west through streets that were empty at this hour, past row houses and shuttered storefronts, and the occasional bar where light leaked through painted windows. The war had ended 4 months ago. The boys were coming home. The city was changing, expanding, reaching towards some version of normalcy that Salvatore knew would never include men like him. He thought about Vincent's children. 3 of them, the oldest barely 12. What would they be told? That their father ran away, that he had gambling debts and disappeared in the night? The truth would reach them eventually, filtered through rumor and innuendo, but they would never know the specifics. They would never know that their father had begged. Everyone begged at the end. The car turned onto Broad Street, passing the ornate facade of City Hall with its tower rising into the rain. Salvatore had been inside exactly once, years ago, paying a fine for a violation that had nothing to do with his real business. The judge had looked at him with contempt, barely concealed, and Salvatore had smiled and paid and walked out into the sun. The law was a game played by people who had never gone hungry, who had never watched their parents break themselves for pennies. The law protected property and order. It did not protect people like the family Salvatore had been born into, immigrants packed 6 to a room in a South Philadelphia tenement where rats were so common you stopped noticing them. He had built something from nothing. He had taken the skills he learned on those streets, how to read men, how to make deals, how to enforce them, and created an empire that stretched from the docks to the suburbs. He employed hundreds. He kept order in neighborhoods where the police rarely ventured. He settled disputes, provided loans, ensured that certain businesses operated smoothly and that certain people stayed in line. And he had done it all with violence held in reserve like a loaded gun. The car stopped at a townhouse on Spruce Street, a brick building with gas lamps on either side of the door. Salvatore climbed the steps and let himself in, moving through rooms furnished with the kind of careful taste that money could buy but never quite make authentic. His wife Angela was asleep upstairs. His daughter Francesca was at college in New York, studying art history. His son, Michael, was in law school at Penn, preparing for a career that would have nothing to do with the family business. That was the dream anyway, that Michael would be legitimate. Salvatore poured himself a drink in the study, Scotch, expensive, imported, and sat in the leather chair by the window. The rain continued its patient drumming. He had once believed that wealth and success would feel different than this, that reaching the top would bring some sense of arrival or peace. Instead, it felt like standing on a platform that was slowly sinking into mud. Every year required more effort to maintain the same position. Every rival eliminated created a vacuum that drew in new competitors. The violence that had built his empire now threatened to consume it. He thought about Vincent again, the moment before the shot, when their eyes met and Vincent understood that no words would change what was about to happen. There had been a kind of resignation in that look, almost relief. The waiting was over. The consequences had arrived. Salvatore had seen that expression before, on other faces, in other dark rooms. He wondered if he would wear it himself someday. The next morning he went to Mass. St. Paul's Church sat on Christian Street, a modest building of brick and limestone that had served the Italian community since before Salvatore was born. His mother had dragged him here every Sunday when he was a boy, rain or shine, through winters when the coal heating barely kept the chill away, and summers when the packed pews smelled of sweat and incense. She had believed with the kind of fierce certainty that required no proof, no logic. God was real. Sin was real. Hell was waiting for those who strayed. She had died in 1937 before she could see how far her son had strayed. Salvatore sat in the back pew, arriving after the service had started and leaving before it ended. He did not take communion. That would have been too much, too obvious a lie. But he came every Sunday, sat in the same spot, and listened to the priest speak about mercy and judgment and the price of sin. The ritual brought no comfort, but it provided a structure, a marker against which he could measure the accumulating weight of his choices. Father Dominic Rousseau led the service that morning, his voice carrying through the church with practiced authority. He was younger than Salvatore by a decade, a bookish man who had grown up in the neighborhood and returned after seminary to serve his community. They had known each other as children, though they had taken very different paths. Father Rousseau spoke about the parable of the prodigal son, about forgiveness and homecoming, and Salvatore felt something twist in his chest, not guilt exactly, but a recognition of distance. He had gone so far from the person his mother wanted him to be that no single act could bridge that gap. After the service, as people filed out into the grey morning, Father Rousseau appeared at Salvatore's pew. They exchanged pleasantries, the careful dance of men who understood each other's position, but could never speak directly. The priest's eyes held knowledge that his words could never acknowledge. Everyone in the neighborhood knew what Salvatore Montagna did. No one spoke of it aloud. "Your mother would be pleased to see you here," Father Rousseau said. "I doubt that," Salvatore replied. "She would see right through me." "Perhaps, but she would also see you trying." The priest hesitated, then added, "There's always a path back, Sal, no matter how far you've gone." Salvatore nodded, said nothing. They both knew some paths led only one direction. He walked home through streets that were coming alive with Sunday morning activity, families heading to breakfast, children playing stickball in the intersection, old men gathering at the corner barber shop. This was his territory, the neighborhood that had made him, and that he now controlled with the same invisible authority that once belonged to the ward bosses and political machines. People nodded as he passed. Some crossed the street. The respect was universal, but it came in different flavors: admiration, fear, calculation. At home, Angela was making breakfast, eggs and toast and coffee that filled the kitchen with warmth. She was 50, still beautiful in the way of women who had survived hardship without letting it twist them. They had married young, before the money, and she had watched him build his empire with the same resigned acceptance she gave to the weather. She did not ask questions. She did not want answers. "You went to Mass," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." "Father Rousseau spoke to you afterward." "He always does." She set a plate in front of him and sat down across the table with her own coffee. They ate in silence, the kind of comfortable quiet that came from decades of shared life. Through the window, Salvatore could see the garden where Angela spent her summers, now dormant for winter, the earth dark and mulched. Everything had its season. Everything had its cycle. "Michael called," she said. "He's coming home for Thanksgiving." "Good." He asked about the business, whether you need him. Salvatore looked up sharply. "What did you tell him?" "That he should focus on school, that his path is his own." She met his eyes. "That's true, isn't it? You don't want him involved." "No," Salvatore said. "I don't." "Then you need to tell him yourself. He thinks he has obligations. He thinks he owes you something." The conversation died there, but it left residue like oil on water. Michael was smart, ambitious, eager to prove himself. He had grown up with privilege that Salvatore had never known, but he still carried the weight of the family name. The neighborhood knew who he was. The other students at Penn knew who his father was. No matter how far he went, that shadow would follow, unless Salvatore could buy him distance. The thought came to him fully formed, as if it had been waiting in some back room of his mind for the right moment to emerge. Money could buy Michael's future. Money could create legitimacy, could fund scholarships and endowments and charitable works that would rewrite the family narrative. But it would take more than the wealth Salvatore had already accumulated. It would take something visible, something undeniable. It would take a cathedral. That afternoon, Salvatore drove to the empty lot on Carpenter Street, where a row of tenements had recently been demolished. The city was clearing slums, making room for new construction, and this particular block sat at the intersection of the Italian and Irish neighborhoods, a contested space that Salvatore had quietly acquired through a series of shell companies and frontmen. He had no specific plans for it. It was simply real estate, an asset on a balance sheet. He stood on the muddy ground and looked at the surrounding buildings, row houses with laundry hanging from fire escapes, a corner grocery with dusty windows, a bar that never closed. This was the neighborhood he had climbed out of, the world his mother had known. And suddenly he could see it, a church rising from this exact spot, limestone and stained glass, a structure so magnificent that it would eclipse everything around it. A monument to God, a declaration of faith, a down payment on redemption. The decision, once made, consumed him with the force of religious conversion. Salvatore met with architects that winter, spreading blueprints across the mahogany table in his study, pointing to cathedrals in books and magazines. He wanted something that would rival old St. Mary's, that would make people stop and stare. The architects nodded, took notes, calculated costs. They did not ask where the money was coming from. That was not their concern. By spring, construction had begun. The foundation was poured in March of 1946, when the last snow was melting and the ground finally thawed enough for excavation. Salvatore visited the site every morning, watching the work crews arrive with their equipment, observing the slow transformation of empty space into structure. The foreman was a man named Donato Ricci, a builder who had done work for Salvatore before, legitimate work, constructing warehouses and storefronts that served as fronts for other operations. Ricci understood the importance of staying on schedule and keeping costs in line. He also understood that failure was not acceptable. The construction attracted attention immediately. Newspapers ran stories about the mysterious benefactor funding the cathedral, speculating about his identity and his motives. Salvatore remained anonymous, operating through layers of intermediaries and shell corporations. The official story was that a consortium of Catholic businessmen had pooled resources to build a church for the community. The truth was simpler and darker. Every dollar came from Salvatore's empire of gambling, loan sharking, protection rackets, and labor union control. Blood money translated into limestone and stained glass. Father Russo visited the construction site in April, his cassock flapping in the spring wind. Salvatore met him at the fence line, where they could watch the workers pouring concrete for the interior pillars. The priest said nothing at first, just watched the activity with an expression that Salvatore could not read. "It will be beautiful," Father Russo finally said. "The community needs something like this, something to be proud of." "That's the goal." "Sal." The priest turned to face him directly. "I need to ask, where is this money coming from? Does it matter?" "You know it does." Salvatore felt anger flare, then fade just as quickly. "The church accepts donations from everyone. Rich men, poor men, sinners and saints. You don't question where the money in the collection plate comes from. That's different." "Is it?" Salvatore gestured at the construction. "This building will serve the community for 100 years. It will provide a place for worship, for baptisms and weddings and funerals. The source of the money doesn't change what it becomes." Father Russo shook his head slowly. "I wish I could believe that. I wish I could tell you that good works erase bad deeds. But it doesn't work that way, Sal. You know it doesn't." "Then why build churches at all?" Salvatore shot back. "Why ask people to donate if their money is tainted? Everyone has sin, Father. Everyone. The only difference is scale." "The difference," Mayat the priest said quietly, "is whether you're trying to change or just trying to hide." They stood in silence after that, watching the workers move like ants across the construction site. Finally, Father Russo touched Salvatore's shoulder, a brief gesture, almost fatherly, and walked away. Salvatore remained at the fence until the sun set, until the work crews packed up their tools, and the site grew quiet, except for the night watchman making his rounds. That evening, he received word that a problem had emerged with one of his operations. A rival family from New York was moving into his territory, trying to take over the waterfront shipping rackets. It was the kind of challenge that required immediate response, the kind of situation where hesitation meant weakness, and weakness meant death. Salvatore made the necessary calls, set the necessary plans in motion. Within a week, 2 New York soldiers disappeared from a hotel room in Center City, their bodies never recovered. The incursion stopped. The message was understood. And the construction continued. The cathedral rose slowly through the summer, floor by floor, window by window. Salvatore watched it grow with the intensity of a man watching his own child develop. Every detail mattered. The stone had to be cut precisely. The windows had to match the architectural drawings. The interior needed to feel sacred. To create the kind of awe that made people understand, they stood in the presence of something larger than themselves. He hired artisans from Italy to carve the altar, to create the statuary that would line the walls. He commissioned stained glass from a workshop in Germany that had survived the war. Each piece of glass was individually cut and leaded, depicting scenes from the lives of saints, martyrdoms and miracles, suffering and salvation. The cost was staggering, but Salvatore never questioned it. This was not about economy, this was about permanence. Angela noticed the change in him. He became obsessed, distant, his mind always at the construction site even when his body was elsewhere. At dinner, he would push food around his plate, barely eating. At night, he would sit in his study with the architectural drawings spread before him, making notes, calculating timelines. The cathedral was no longer just a building. It had become his purpose, his mission, his pathway to something he could not name but desperately needed. "You're killing yourself over this," Angela said one evening in July. They were sitting on the back porch, the air thick with humidity, cicadas singing in the darkness. "You need to step back, let other people handle the details." "I can't." "Why not?" He did not have an answer that would make sense to her. How could he explain that the cathedral represented his only chance at meaning, that without it, his life was just a ledger of violence and profit? How could he tell her that every stone placed was a prayer he could not speak aloud? "It's important," he said finally. "It needs to be perfect." "Nothing's perfect, Sal. Nothing human, anyway." She was right, of course, but perfection was the only standard that mattered. If the cathedral was flawed, if it showed the corruption at its source, then the entire project would fail. It had to transcend its origins. It had to become something pure. By autumn, the walls had reached full height, and the roof was being installed. The structure dominated the skyline of the neighborhood, visible from blocks away. People walked by to watch the progress, to marvel at the scale and ambition. Salvatore heard their conversations from his car as he sat parked across the street, listening. "Who's paying for all this?" "Some rich guy, anonymous donor. Must be nice to have that kind of money. Must be nice to have that much guilt." The last comment came from an old woman in a black dress, walking with a cane. She said it to her companion without malice, just observation. But the words hit Salvatore like a physical blow. She understood. The neighborhood understood. They knew that cathedrals did not rise from empty lots unless someone was trying to buy something from God. That night, Salvatore did not sleep. He lay in bed listening to Angela breathe beside him, watching the shadows move across the ceiling. His mind would not stop cataloging the dead, not just Vincent Caruso, but all the others across 26 years. Men who had crossed him, men who had failed him, men who were simply in the way. Their names formed a litany that stretched back through his memory like beads on a rosary. And behind them, the others, the people affected by his business who never knew his name, the families destroyed by gambling debts, the workers exploited through corrupt unions, the small business owners forced to pay protection or close their doors, the ripples of his violence spreading outward like waves from a stone thrown in dark water. The cathedral would not erase any of it. But maybe it would count for something in whatever accounting came after death. If there was an accounting, if anything waited beyond the silence. By winter, the interior work had begun. Plasterers and painters and craftsmen moved through the space, transforming bare walls into glory. The ceiling was painted with frescoes depicting biblical scenes, the creation, the crucifixion, the resurrection. The altar was installed, carved from white marble imported from Carrara. The pews arrived from a furniture maker in Lancaster, each one crafted from oak and fitted with cushions covered in red velvet. Salvatore walked through the unfinished cathedral on a December morning, when the air inside still smelled of wet plaster and sawdust. His footsteps echoed in the vast space. Light streamed through the completed windows on the eastern wall, throwing colors across the floor, ruby and sapphire and emerald, patterns that shifted as clouds moved across the sun. He stood at the altar and looked back toward the entrance, imagining the pews filled with worshippers, the space alive with prayer and song. For a moment he could feel what it would be like to kneel here honestly, to confess without reservation, to receive absolution that actually meant something. Then the moment passed and he was himself again, Don Salvatore Montagna, builder of empires, collector of debts, dealer in death and silence, the man who thought he could buy God's favor with blood money. The first serious problem emerged in January of 1947, when the cathedral was 6 months from completion. Donato Ricci, the construction foreman, came to Salvatore's office on a Tuesday morning, his face pale despite the winter cold. "We need to talk," Ricci said. Closing the door behind him, Salvatore was reviewing ledgers, tracking the flow of money through his various operations. He looked up, registered the foreman's expression, and knew immediately that something had gone wrong. What happened? One of the workers, a man named Pietro Gallo, he's been asking questions about the project financing. What kind of questions? Where the money's coming from? Who the real donor is? Ricci shifted his weight. "He's connected, Sal. His brother is a reporter at the Inquirer. I think he's gathering information to leak." The room was silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Salvatore set down his pen and folded his hands on the desk. "How much does he know?" "Enough. He's seen the shell companies. He's traced some of the money back to your operations." "Can you buy him off?" "I tried. He refused. He says—" Ricci hesitated. "He says building a church with dirty money is a sin, that God won't accept it." Salvatore felt something cold settle in his chest. "Where is he now?" "Still working on site. I haven't told him we know about his snooping." "Keep it that way." Salvatore stood, walked to the window that overlooked the street. Snow was falling, light flakes that melted on contact with the pavement. "I'll handle it." Ricci nodded and left, and Salvatore remained at the window, watching the snow accumulate on parked cars and window ledges. Pietro Gallo. The name was vaguely familiar, one of dozens of workers who had cycled through the construction site, faces Salvatore had seen but never really registered. Now that face had become a problem, a threat to everything he was trying to build. The old response would have been simple: eliminate the threat. A construction accident was easy to arrange, scaffolding that collapsed, a fall from height, equipment that malfunctioned at the wrong moment. Gallo would die, his brother would mourn, and the story would die with him. But the thought made Salvatore physically ill in a way it never had before. Killing to protect the cathedral, using violence to shield a monument to God. The contradiction was too blatant, too obscene. If he did this, he would prove that the old woman was right, that guilt was the only pure thing about his project. He spent 3 days wrestling with the decision. The construction continued. Pietro Gallo showed up every morning with his lunch pail, worked his shift and left at sunset. Salvatore had him followed, learning his routine: a small apartment in Gray's Ferry, a wife and infant son, a life that was modest but stable. Gallo went to Mass every evening, kneeling in the pews at St. Rita's for 20 minutes before walking home. A religious man, a man with principles. On the 4th day, Salvatore went to the construction site at dawn, before the work crews arrived. He waited in his car, watching the sun rise over the half-finished cathedral, its silhouette stark against the pink sky. When Pietro Gallo arrived, Salvatore intercepted him at the gate. "I need to speak with you," Salvatore said. "In private." Gallo's face went through several expressions: surprise, recognition, fear. He knew who Salvatore was. Everyone knew. "Mr. Montagna, please, just a conversation." They walked to a nearby diner, a small place that was nearly empty at this hour. Salvatore ordered coffee for them both and then sat across from Gallo in a back booth. The younger man's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his cup. "You've been asking questions about the cathedral project," Salvatore said, "about where the money is coming from." Gallo swallowed hard, but did not deny it. "Yes." "Why?" "Because—" Gallo looked down at his coffee. "Because it's wrong. Building a church with stolen money, with blood money. God won't accept it. It's blasphemy. And you plan to expose this? Tell your brother, let him print a story?" "I don't know." Gallo's voice was barely a whisper. "I've been praying about it, trying to figure out what's right." Salvatore felt a strange kinship with this man. this worker who shared his doubts and struggled with the same moral questions. They both understood that the cathedral was tainted. They both knew that the structure rising on Carpenter Street could never truly be holy, no matter how beautiful it became. "What if I told you," Salvatore said carefully, "that this cathedral is the only good thing I've ever built, that every other part of my life is darkness, but this is my attempt at light?" "It doesn't work that way," Gallo said, echoing Father Russo's words. "You can't build righteousness on top of sin. The foundation matters. Then nothing I do matters. Nothing can be redeemed. You could stop. You could leave that life, try to make amends." Salvatore laughed, a sound without humor. "I'm 52 years old. I've spent 30 years building an empire of violence. If I stop now, if I try to walk away, there are 100 men who will come for me. Rivals, enemies, even my own people who see weakness. And if I somehow survive that, what then? Confess everything? Go to prison? Leave my family with nothing?" "Your family already has nothing," Gallo said quietly. "Not the things that matter. You're trying to buy redemption for your son with blood money, but it won't work. He'll carry your name and your sins whether you build a cathedral or not." The truth of it struck like a hammer blow. Michael was already marked, already compromised by association. No amount of legitimate wealth could change who his father was, what the Montagna name meant in Philadelphia. The cathedral would not save him any more than it would save Salvatore. "What do you want from me?" Salvatore asked. "I want you to stop the construction. Donate the land to the city. Let them build something honest." "I can't do that. Then I'll tell my brother everything. The story will run, and everyone will know the truth." They sat in silence. Outside, the city was waking up. Delivery trucks making rounds, workers heading to factories, the first morning commuters filling the streets. In 6 hours, the construction crews would arrive at the cathedral site. In 6 months, if nothing changed, the building would be complete. Salvatore made his decision. "If you tell your brother," he said, "you'll be dead within a week. You understand that? I'm not threatening you, I'm telling you reality. There are people in my organization who will not tolerate exposure. They will eliminate the threat. Then I'll be a martyr. You'll be a corpse, your wife will be a widow, your son will grow up without a father." Salvatore leaned forward. "Is that really what God wants? For you to die for a principle that won't change anything? The cathedral will still be built. Your death won't stop it." Gallo's hands were shaking harder now. Tears leaked from the corners of his eyes. "What should I do?" "Walk away, quit the job, take your family and move somewhere else. I'll give you money, clean money from legitimate sources, enough to start over. That's a bribe. That's survival, for both of us." The younger man wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Salvatore could see the war happening behind those eyes. Faith versus fear, principle versus pragmatism. He knew which side would win. It always did, when the gun was on the table, even if no one mentioned it. "How much?" Gallo asked, and Salvatore knew the crisis had passed. They negotiated in low voices, 2 men making a deal over coffee that had gone cold. $10,000, a fortune for a construction worker, barely noticeable in Salvatore's accounts. Gallo would quit that day, tell his wife they were moving to Pittsburgh, where his cousin had a factory job lined up. He would never speak of the cathedral's financing, never tell his brother what he had learned. He would carry the secret until it rotted inside him. When they parted outside the diner, Salvatore watched Gallo walk away. Shoulders hunched, head down, a man who had just sold his principles for security. The sight should have brought relief or satisfaction. Instead, Salvatore felt only disgust at himself, at the corruption that spread from him like disease, infecting everyone it touched. Even good men could be bought. Even faith had its price. He returned to his car and drove to the construction site, where the work crews were arriving for the day shift. The cathedral rose before him, its skeleton now clothed in stone and glass, its presence imposing even in its unfinished state. This was his legacy, this monument to contradiction, a house of God built on the bodies of the damned. Gallo's words echoed in his mind. The foundation matters. But it was too late to rebuild the foundation. The cathedral was too far along, too much invested to stop now. All Salvatore could do was finish what he started and hope that somehow, in the alchemy of stone and prayer, the building could transcend its origins. That night he gave Angela the $10,000 to deliver to Pietro Gallo. She asked no questions, as always. She simply took the envelope and made the delivery, returning an hour later to report that the Gallo family would be leaving Philadelphia within the week. "The wife was crying," Angela said. "Happy tears," she said. "They're grateful for the opportunity." Salvatore nodded, poured himself a drink, and retreated to his study. The cathedral blueprints were still spread across his desk, marked with his notes and calculations. He stared at them until the lines blurred, until the careful architecture dissolved into abstraction. Somewhere in the city, Pietro Gallo was packing his belongings, preparing to run from truth that he could not afford to speak. Somewhere else, men were collecting debts in Salvatore's name, enforcing the rules of an empire built on fear. And on Carpenter Street, the cathedral waited for morning when work would resume and it would rise another few feet toward heaven. All of it connected, all of it his. "The foundation matters," Gallo had said. But Salvatore was learning that foundations could be buried, hidden beneath beauty and reverence. The question was whether God could see through limestone to the blood underneath, or whether God was watching at all. Spring arrived with unexpected warmth, and the cathedral entered its final phase of construction. The exterior was complete, a masterpiece of neo-Gothic architecture that dominated the neighborhood skyline. The twin towers rose 100 feet, each capped with a copper spire that would turn green with age. The facade featured a rose window 20 feet in diameter, its glass depicting the Virgin Mary surrounded by angels. Every detail was executed with the precision Salvatore had demanded, every element contributing to an overall impression of divine permanence. Inside, craftsmen worked on the final touches, installing the organ pipes, hanging the stations of the cross along the side aisles, laying marble floor tiles in geometric patterns. The space had begun to feel sacred, the acoustics perfect for prayer and song. The light through the stained glass creating patterns that moved across the walls like living things. Salvatore visited every day, sometimes twice. He had lost weight, his suits hanging loose on a frame that had once been solid. Angela worried about him openly now, insisting he eat, suggesting he see a doctor. But food had no taste, and doctors could not diagnose what ailed him. The cathedral was consuming him, demanding every ounce of his attention and energy. Michael came home for Easter break, tall and confident in his law school suit. He looked like someone who belonged to the legitimate world, someone who could walk into boardrooms and courtrooms without shadow. Salvatore felt pride mixed with grief, pride at what his son had become, grief at the price that had been paid. They drove to the cathedral together on a Thursday morning, Salvatore wanting to show Michael the culmination of his work. They parked across the street and stood looking at the building, its presence commanding respect even from atheists. "It's incredible," Michael said. "I had no idea it would be this large. It needs to serve the community for generations. It needs to last." "How much did this cost?" The question was casual, but Salvatore heard the weight behind it. Michael was studying law, learning to read documents and trace money. He understood that a project of this scale required enormous funding. "Does it matter?" Salvatore replied. "Dad," Michael turned to face him directly. "I know what you do. I'm not a child anymore. I know how the business works, where the money comes from." "Then you know I don't discuss it. This cathedral, is this about guilt, about trying to buy forgiveness?" The directness of it was startling. Salvatore had never spoken openly with Michael about the moral dimensions of his work. They had maintained careful distance, father and son divided by unspoken truths. "It's about legacy," Salvatore said finally, "about creating something that outlasts me, something good. But it's not good, is it? Not really. Not if it's built with dirty money. Every fortune in this country is built on someone's exploitation. The difference is time and distance. 100 years from now, no one will remember where the money came from. They'll just see the cathedral." Michael shook his head. "You don't believe that. If you did, you wouldn't look so haunted." They stood in silence, two men who shared blood, but lived in different moral universes. Salvatore wanted to tell his son everything, the weight of 3 decades of violence, the names that whispered through his mind at night, the desperate hope that this building could somehow balance the ledger. But the words would not come. Some truths were too heavy to share. "I don't want you in this business," Salvatore said instead. "I want you to finish law school, build a clean career, marry a good woman, have children who never know what their grandfather did." "It doesn't work that way, Dad. The name stays with me. Your reputation is my inheritance, whether you want it to be or not." "Then change the name. Go somewhere else. Start fresh." "Is that what you want? For me to pretend you don't exist?" "I want you to be free," Salvatore said, and the desperation in his voice surprised them both. Michael was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and gripped his father's shoulder, a gesture of connection, of acknowledgement that they were bound together by forces stronger than choice. "The cathedral is beautiful," Michael said. "Whatever else it is, whatever it cost, it's a beautiful thing you've built." They returned to the car and drove home in silence. That night at dinner, they spoke of ordinary things: Michael's classes, his upcoming exams, the summer internship he had secured at a center city law firm. The cathedral was not mentioned. The business was not mentioned. They maintained the fiction that their lives were separate, that Michael's future was not shadowed by his father's past. But Salvatore saw the knowledge in his son's eyes, the understanding that had always been there but was now acknowledged. Michael knew. He had always known. And the cathedral, magnificent as it was, could not protect him from that truth. After Michael returned to New York, Salvatore descended into a kind of fever. He micromanaged every remaining detail of the construction, arguing with craftsmen over the placement of decorative elements, rejecting work that was not perfect. Donato Ricci began making excuses not to meet with him, sending subordinates instead. The workers whispered that the anonymous donor had lost his mind, that the project had become an obsession. They were right. The cathedral was no longer just a building. It had become the physical manifestation of Salvatore's soul, and he could not accept any flaw in its construction because every flaw reflected his own corruption. One night in May, unable to sleep, he drove to the construction site at 3 a.m. The night watchman let him through the gates, accustomed by now to the donor's irregular visits. Salvatore entered the cathedral through the side door, moved through the dark space guided by moonlight through the stained glass windows. He walked to the altar and knelt. He had not knelt to pray in 20 years. He had attended Mass, sat in pews, observed the rituals from a distance, but actually kneeling, actually attempting to communicate with God, that had seemed too presumptuous, too dishonest given the life he led. Now in the darkness of this unfinished church, he bowed his head and tried to find words. No prayer came, just the names of the dead cycling through his consciousness like a litany. Vincent Caruso, the New York soldiers, the union leader who had refused to cooperate, the accountant who had stolen, the dozens of others across 3 decades, men whose faces he barely remembered, but whose deaths he had ordered or committed. Behind them, the faces he had never seen, the families destroyed, the lives ruined, the ripples of violence spreading outward from every decision he made, and ahead of him, the final accounting. Whatever waited after death, if anything waited at all. Salvatore remained kneeling until dawn, until the sky outside the windows shifted from black to gray to pale gold. When he finally stood, his knees ached and his back was stiff. He felt no different, no absolution, no peace, no sense that his prayer had been heard or answered. The cathedral was just stone and glass. Beautiful, yes. Permanent, perhaps. But not sacred. Not in any way that mattered. He walked out into the morning light, past the watchman who nodded respectfully, and drove home through streets that were just beginning to wake. Angela was already up, making coffee in the kitchen. She looked at him with concern that had become permanent, etched into the lines around her eyes. "You were gone all night." "I was at the cathedral." "Sal, this is killing you. You need to stop." "I can't, not until it's finished." "And then what? What happens after it's dedicated? Will you suddenly be free? Will all this guilt just disappear?" He had no answer for her, and she did not press. They drank their coffee in silence, and then Salvatore went to his study and called his lawyer to begin the arrangements for the dedication ceremony. The cathedral would be completed in 3 months. Archbishop Dougherty had agreed to consecrate the building. A date was set, November 8th, the feast day of the Holy Innocents. The irony of that was not lost on Salvatore. As summer progressed, the cathedral neared completion. The organ was installed, its pipes filling one wall of the choir loft. The pews were bolted to the floor in perfect rows. The confessionals were built into the side chapels, dark wooden boxes where sins would be whispered and absolution granted or denied. Every surface gleamed with fresh polish. Every window sparkled with light. Father Russo came for a final inspection in October, walking through the space with Salvatore and the Archbishop's representative. The priest said very little, but his expression was complicated. Wonder mixed with sadness, appreciation tainted by knowledge of the cathedral's origins. When they reached the altar, Father Russo placed his hand on the white marble and looked up at the ceiling frescoes. "It truly is magnificent," he said. "The community will treasure this for generations." "But," Salvatore prompted. "But nothing. It is what it is." The priest turned to face him. "You've built a beautiful shell, Sal. Whether there's anything sacred inside it, that's between you and God. And what do you think? Will God accept it?" Father Russo was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I think God accepts everything and everyone. That's the nature of grace. But acceptance isn't the same as approval. This cathedral won't buy you absolution. Only you can do that by changing your life. I'm trying. Are you, or are you just building monuments?" The question hung in the air between them. Salvatore had no answer that would satisfy either of them. The truth was that he did not know how to change, did not know how to dismantle an empire that had taken decades to build. The violence was too entrenched, the structures too complex. Even if he wanted to walk away, the business would continue without him, managed by men with fewer scruples and no interest in redemption. And he was tired, so profoundly tired that the thought of change seemed impossible. Father Russo left with the Archbishop's representative, and Salvatore remained alone in the cathedral. He walked the perimeter, checking every detail, ensuring that everything was ready for the dedication. The space was perfect, or as close to perfect as human hands could achieve. No expense had been spared, no shortcut had been taken. But perfection in architecture did not translate to purity of purpose. The cathedral could be flawless in every physical dimension and still carry the stain of its origins like original sin. As October turned to November, invitations were sent to civic leaders, religious figures, and prominent members of the Italian community. The dedication ceremony would be a major event, attended by hundreds. Salvatore would remain anonymous, sitting in the crowd as just another parishioner. The cathedral would be presented as a community achievement, a collective effort to glorify God. The lie was necessary. The truth would destroy everything. 3 days before the dedication, Salvatore received word that one of his enforcers had killed a man in a dispute over gambling debts. The details were mundane: an argument in a bar, a punch that landed wrong, a skull that cracked against concrete. The death was accidental in the technical sense, but it was still murder. The enforcer was in hiding. The police were investigating. Salvatore arranged for lawyers for payoffs for the witnesses to forget what they had seen. He did what he always did, applying money and pressure until the problem dissolved. The enforcer would be protected. The investigation would stall. Justice would be buried under layers of corruption. And then he would attend the dedication of his cathedral. The contradiction was so blatant that Salvatore almost laughed. Here he was, preparing to celebrate a monument to God while simultaneously orchestrating a cover-up of murder. The two actions existed in his life simultaneously, overlapping like intersecting circles in a Venn diagram. He was both the benefactor and the criminal, the penitent and the sinner, the man who built churches and the man who ordered killings. Which identity was real? Which was the lie? Maybe both were true. Maybe he contained multitudes, contradictions that could never be resolved. The night before the dedication, Salvatore sat in his study with a bottle of scotch, reviewing the list of people who would attend the ceremony. Politicians, priests, businessmen, the respectable face of Philadelphia society. Many of them knew who he was. Many of them had benefited from his influence directly or indirectly. The city ran on compromises and quiet arrangements, on the understanding that order sometimes required bending the law. They would attend his cathedral's dedication and say nothing about the source of the money. They would pray and sing hymns and accept the beauty without questioning the cost. And maybe that was how the world actually worked. Maybe moral purity was an illusion, a story people told themselves to feel better about the compromises they made every day. Maybe everyone was guilty of something, and the only difference between Salvatore and the politicians in the pews was the distance between them and the actual violence. Or maybe he was just rationalizing, finding excuses for choices that had no excuse. The bottle of scotch was half empty when Angela found him in the study. She took the glass from his hand and set it aside, then sat down across from him. "Tomorrow is supposed to be a celebration," she said. "Try to rest tonight." "I can't." "What are you afraid of?" The question surprised him with its directness. Angela rarely pushed, rarely demanded answers. But tonight, on the eve of the cathedral's dedication, she wanted truth. "I'm afraid," Salvatore said slowly, "that it won't matter. That I've spent 3 years and a fortune building something that changes nothing. That my son will still carry my sins. That my soul is still damned. That all of this—" He gestured vaguely at the blueprints, the ledgers, the physical representation of his obsession, "is just vanity. It's not vanity to want to do something good, even if the good is built on evil." Angela was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't know the answer to that. I'm not a philosopher or a priest, but I know you, and I know you're trying, in your own way, to be better than you were. Is it enough?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but maybe trying is all we can do." She left him alone after that, and Salvatore sat in the darkness until dawn began to grey the windows. Then he showered, dressed in his best suit and prepared to attend the dedication of his cathedral, the monument to everything he was and everything he could never be. November 8th arrived cold and grey, the sky heavy with the threat of rain. Salvatore woke before dawn, unable to sleep past the moment when the first light touched his window. Angela was already awake beside him, watching him with the same concerned expression that had become permanent over the last 3 years. "Ready?" she asked. "No." But they rose anyway, dressed in their formal clothes, and prepared for the day that would mark either triumph or judgment. Salvatore was no longer sure which. The drive to the cathedral took 15 minutes through streets that were already filling with people. Word of the dedication had spread through the neighborhood, and hundreds were gathering to see the new church. Many had watched its construction over the past 3 years, observing the slow transformation from empty lot to architectural marvel. Now they came to witness its consecration, to claim it as their own. Salvatore parked 3 blocks away and walked to the cathedral with Angela. He wore a dark suit, simple and expensive but not ostentatious. He wanted to blend into the crowd, to be just another member of the community celebrating a new church. The anonymity was essential. His gift to God required that he remain invisible, that the building transcend its donor. The crowd was larger than expected. Hundreds of people filled the street, pressing close to the barriers that had been erected to create a pathway to the cathedral's doors. Salvatore and Angela joined the throng, working their way forward slowly. The air smelled of perfume and damp wool, of the rain that had started to fall in light drops that misted everything they touched. Archbishop Dougherty arrived at 9 o'clock in a black car flanked by police motorcycles. He emerged in his ceremonial vestments, white and gold, glittering with embroidered crosses and sacred symbols. The crowd pressed forward to see him, and flashbulbs popped as photographers captured the moment. The Archbishop climbed the cathedral steps slowly, his movements deliberate and hieratic, while altar boys in white surplices followed with candles and incense. Salvatore watched from the 3rd row, holding Angela's hand. His heart was beating too fast, a flutter in his chest that made him lightheaded. This was the moment 3 years of work had built toward, the consecration that would transform limestone and glass into sacred space. But would it? Could ritual sanctify a building whose foundations were laid in blood? The Archbishop reached the doors and paused, turning to face the crowd. His voice carried across the gathering, amplified by the stone walls that curved around the entrance. Brothers and sisters in Christ, we gather today to dedicate this cathedral to the glory of God and the service of His people. This house of worship stands as a testament to faith, to the generosity of believers who have given their resources to create a space where generations will come to pray, to celebrate the sacraments, to find peace in troubled times. Salvatore felt those words like physical blows. Generosity, faith, the language of sanctity applied to his project, to money earned through violence and coercion. The disconnect between the Archbishop's words and the reality was so vast that Salvatore wondered how no one else seemed to notice. Or maybe they did notice. Maybe everyone knew and chose to accept it anyway, because the cathedral was beautiful and the neighborhood needed it, and pragmatism always won over principle in the end. The Archbishop sprinkled holy water on the doors, on the walls, on the threshold where worshippers would enter. He recited prayers in Latin, ancient words that had sanctified churches for centuries. The ritual was familiar, comforting in its predictability. This was how cathedrals were made, through liturgy and blessing, through the church's authority to declare space sacred. The doors opened and the procession moved inside. The cathedral's interior was transformed for the dedication. Flowers covered every surface, candles burned in rows along the aisles, and the organ began to play, its sound rolling through the space like thunder. The crowd filed in behind the Archbishop, filling the pews that Salvatore had commissioned from the craftsmen in Lancaster. Salvatore and Angela found seats near the back, far from the altar where the Archbishop would perform the consecration mass. Salvatore could barely focus on the service. His attention kept drifting to the details, the way light fell through the stained glass, the echo of the organ in the vaulted ceiling, the carved angels that looked down from their niches, with expressions that seemed to Salvatore both judgmental and pitying. The Mass proceeded according to liturgy. The Archbishop consecrated bread and wine, elevating them toward the crucifix above the altar. The faithful received communion, a long line processing forward to kneel at the rail. Salvatore did not join them. He remained in his pew watching others receive the sacrament he had not taken in 20 years. Father Russo was among the priests distributing communion. Their eyes met across the cathedral, and Salvatore saw in the priest's expression a mix of emotions too complex to name: approval and disappointment, admiration and grief. Father Russo knew what this building cost. He knew who had paid for it and how the money was earned, and yet he was here, participating in the consecration, accepting the cathedral into the life of the church. Maybe that was how grace worked, accepting the flawed offerings of broken people, transforming them through ritual and prayer into something that could serve the divine. Or maybe it was just hypocrisy dressed in vestments. The Mass concluded with a blessing. The Archbishop raised his hands over the congregation and declared the cathedral consecrated, set apart for sacred use. The organ swelled into the recessional hymn, and people began to file out, talking excitedly about the beauty of the building and the magnificence of the service. Salvatore remained seated until most of the crowd had left. Then he stood, still holding Angela's hand, and walked slowly toward the exit. As they passed through the doors into the grey afternoon, he looked back at the cathedral one last time. It stood exactly as he had envisioned it 3 years ago, imposing, beautiful, permanent. A monument that would serve the community for generations. But it brought him no peace. The burden he had carried for 3 years had not lifted with the consecration. The names still whispered in his mind. The guilt still pressed on his chest like a physical weight. The cathedral was finished, but he remained unchanged. Outside, the crowd was dispersing, people heading home or to restaurants for celebratory meals. Politicians posed for photographs on the cathedral steps. Reporters interviewed the Archbishop about the significance of the new building. Everything proceeded according to script, a perfect public relations moment for the church and the community. No one mentioned the money. No one asked about the anonymous donor who had funded the project. The fiction of collective generosity was maintained, and everyone seemed content to let it stand. Salvatore and Angela walked back to their car in silence. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflecting. When they reached the car, Angela turned to him before getting in. "You did a good thing," she said. "Whatever else is true, you gave the community something beautiful." "Did I? Or did I just build a monument to my own guilt?" "Maybe both can be true." She got in the car, ending the conversation. Salvatore stood on the sidewalk for another moment, looking back toward the cathedral's towers rising above the row houses. Then he climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The drive home was short, but Salvatore felt the distance like miles. The cathedral was consecrated, his project complete, but he had failed at the one thing that mattered. He had not transformed himself. The building could not redeem him. God would not accept his offering because the offering was corrupt at its source. Father Russo had been right. You could not build righteousness on a foundation of sin. At home, Salvatore went directly to his study and poured a drink. He sat in his leather chair and stared at the blueprints that still covered his desk, the physical remnant of 3 years of obsession, all those hours of planning, all that money spent, all the craftsmen employed and materials imported. And for what? A building that would serve others but save no one. Certainly not him. The phone rang in the late afternoon. It was one of his lieutenants, calling about a problem that required Salvatore's decision. A dispute with a union that was threatening to strike. A rival family moving into territory they had agreed was off limits, the usual business of the empire he had built. Salvatore gave his orders, firm but not violent, maintaining the balance that had kept him alive and in power for 30 years. When he hung up, he realized that the cathedral had changed nothing about his life. He was still Don Salvatore Montagna, still making decisions that affected lives and careers and criminal enterprises. The consecration of his cathedral had not transformed him into someone else. He was who he had always been, a man who dealt in violence and corruption, who maintained order through fear, who carried the weight of countless deaths on his conscience. The cathedral stood on Carpenter Street, beautiful and permanent, but Salvatore remained in darkness, unchanged and unredeemed. That night he did not sleep. He sat in his study with the lights off, watching shadows move across the ceiling. At some point, Angela came to check on him, but she did not speak. She simply stood in the doorway for a moment, then retreated, understanding that there was nothing she could say that would help. As dawn approached, Salvatore finally acknowledged the truth he had been avoiding for 3 years. The cathedral was not for God. It was not even for the community, though they would benefit from it. The cathedral was for him, an attempt to buy something that could not be purchased, to build something that would outlast the corruption of his life. But cathedrals were made of stone, and stone was silent. It could not forgive, it could not redeem. It could only stand as testament to the ambition and guilt of the man who had built it. The sun rose over Philadelphia, light spreading across the city. Somewhere on Carpenter Street, the cathedral waited for its first Sunday Mass, for the families who would come to worship in its pews. Life would go on. The building would serve its purpose. And Salvatore would continue carrying his burden, unchanged and unabsolved, until the day when his own reckoning finally came.